So this time of year brings us through a time of seemingly a lot of busyness, a lot of preparation for the events that we have. And as we get closer and closer and closer to Christmas, it seems like the calendar gets more full, we get more busy, and often a whole lot more cranky with it. And, you know, it helps us to obviously refocus on why we're doing what we're doing. So we need to think about, as we are preparing for the arrival of the Messiah, we should be humbled that He would give His favor to us. We need to think about things like, why would He do this? What did we do to deserve it? How should we live in response to it as well? Today we're going to look again at the story of Mary and Elizabeth in Luke chapter 1. And we're going to discover through their example that God's favor is poured out on us for His glory and for the sake of others. So we're going to look at Mary. Luke chapter 1, verses 39 through 59. Luke 1, 39 through 59. At that time, Mary got ready and hurried to a town in the hill country of Judea, where she entered Zechariah's home and greeted Elizabeth. When Elizabeth heard Mary's greeting, the baby leaped in her womb, and Elizabeth was filled with the Holy Spirit. In a loud voice she exclaimed, "Blessed are you among women, and blessed is this child you will bear. But why am I so favored that the mother of my Lord should come to me? As soon as the sound of your greeting reached my ears, the baby in my womb leaped for joy. Blessed is she who has believed that what the Lord has said to her will be accomplished." And Mary said, "My soul glorifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God my Savior. For He has been mindful of the humble state of His servant. From now on all generations will call me blessed. For the Mighty One has done great things for me. Holy is His name. His mercy extends to those who fear Him from generation to generation. He has performed mighty deeds with His arm. He has scattered those who are proud in their inmost thoughts. He has brought down rulers from their thrones, but has lifted up the humble. He has filled the hungry with good things, but has sent the rich away empty. He has helped His servant Israel, remembering to be merciful to Abraham and his descendants forever, even as He said to our fathers." Mary stayed with Elizabeth for about 3 months and then returned home. When it was time for Elizabeth to have her baby, she gave birth to a son. Her neighbors and relatives heard that the Lord had shown her great mercy, and they shared her joy. On the 8th day they came to circumcise the child, and they were going to name him after his father Zechariah. But his mother spoke up and said, "No, he is to be called John." So we see in this account, kind of from a historical perspective, Mary having had an encounter with the angel Gabriel and knowing that she was going to give birth to the Son of God. As a single woman, she was engaged, she was committed to her husband to be, but not yet married. It created certainly some tense days for her in her hometown and within her family. And she went to visit her cousin Elizabeth, who we learned a few weeks ago had been barren for years, and at a relatively old age was miraculously allowed to become pregnant, to have a baby. And this baby would be who we now know as John the Baptist, who kind of prepared the way for Jesus' ministry. So Mary goes to visit Elizabeth, and even within their wombs, John the Baptist recognizes the presence of the Son of God, which is a pretty awesome thing. And we read here of the excitement and rejoicing between these two women. Yes, to have time together, but at what God is doing in their lives and through them, the favor that He is showing upon them. So our focus today is looking at God's favor and how that applies to our lives and what that means for us. We need to consider and understand what we mean when we talk about the favor of God. Too often we have a misconception that the favor of God is really more of a blessing. It's a term that gets thrown around too casually. We really don't understand what it is, and a lot of times pastors are guilty in perpetuating this misconception. But think about, how often have you heard well-meaning Christians or pastors talk about the favor of God, usually in relation to a good break, or what we would call good luck. Maybe you get stopped by the police and God's favor shined upon you, so you got a warning and not a ticket. Well, that's not God's favor. Or we think about, if we travel. I used to, when I traveled for business, I always used to like to get upgraded to first class. That was a good thing, right? Well, that's not God's favor, but we talk about it that way. Things like getting free tickets to a big game, or getting a good deal on a major purchase, a shiny car, a bigger TV, or whatever. Those things are not God's favor. But too commonly, we do refer to those as being the favor of God. We say, wow, God was really smiling upon me and helped me in that situation. His favor was upon me. And certainly those things we can look at as blessings, and we should be grateful for them. But we don't want to, it looks like you're getting bitten. We don't want to mistake that with God's favor. So when we look at the biblical concept of God's favor, there's a common theme anytime we see the favor of God being expressed in the Bible. And that theme is this. When God's favor is upon us, it usually comes along with God trusting us to bear a difficult mission. And it also is typically that God's grace is poured out on us for the sake of others. If we want to look at a couple of examples outside of this experience of Mary and Elizabeth, we can think of Joseph in the Old Testament. And, we remember maybe that Joseph was the youngest of many sons, and was Dad's favorite, and his older brothers were jealous. And so they sold him into slavery, pretended he was dead. They actually were going to kill him, but sold him into slavery instead. And throughout Joseph's adolescent and into his adult life, he had these situations crop up that, initially he became kind of the head of the household for a governor, until the governor's wife decided that she wasn't happy with him refusing her flirtations and accused him of rape, so he was in prison. But then again, he rose to great responsibility in the land to the point that he interpreted a dream and put together a national plan to save a nation through a 7-year famine. So we see Joseph experiencing this difficulty, and he was brought into, we can see God's favor brought him into those leadership situations where he applied his God-given wisdom. God's grace was upon him by taking him out of prison and putting him into those roles. But his mission was difficult. It was difficult in the sense that he had to manage this and kind of plan and put together this plan to save this nation from famine. It was difficult also in the sense that some period of time into this famine, he had to face the same brothers who first tried to kill him and then sold him into slavery and provide them with food. So we see in the case of Joseph that there was a difficult mission that God had in mind for him. And God's grace was upon Joseph, not so much for himself, but for the sake of others, including a nation. There's a story that I read, about 6 months ago, about a missionary couple serving in the area of the Amazon, kind of jungle country, right? And the story that I read was written by a pastor who had visited with them. And this pastor, in his experience, was talking. He'd been following this missionary couple for about a week, and he made the comment, he said, "Boy, I don't know that I could do what you do. You must really love what you're doing in order to devote your life to this." And the missionary, the husband, looked at this pastor and said, "We hate living here. 20 years of living in tents, dealing with bad water, bugs, critters of every kind, terrible weather. We absolutely hate it. But it's what God told us to do. So we do it." So in the case of that missionary couple in the Amazon, God gave them a difficult mission. His grace was poured out on them for the sake of others that were in that area in the Amazon, that they may come to know God through Christ as well. So favor is not, again, it's not good luck or good fortune, but rather it is God giving us a difficult mission and His grace coming to us for us to share with others, not to keep for ourselves. So in the story of Elizabeth and Mary, one of the questions that we might ask is, why does God pour out His favor on Elizabeth and Mary? We see that word used to describe both women, that God's favor is upon them. Both seem equally surprised to be favored. If we look at Elizabeth's response to seeing Mary, we see that Elizabeth heard Mary's greeting. The baby leapt in her womb, and Elizabeth was filled with the Holy Spirit. She exclaimed, "Blessed are you among women, and blessed is this child. Why am I so favored that the mother of my Lord should come to me?" So we see that she is blown away by the honor of, yes, carrying the forerunner, we'll call it, of Jesus, and to be in the presence of Mary, the mother of the Christ, the coming Messiah. And we look at Mary's song, verses 46 through 55. Mary's response to what Elizabeth said was actually a song that she sang, a song of praise. And she talks about the favor of the Lord and how powerful and how merciful and how wonderful God is, and how that favor is upon her for the purpose of others. Mary's overwhelmed and humbled by this. So what attributes set up Mary and Elizabeth to receive God's favor? What actions and accomplishments put them in the path of that blessing? As far as we can tell, there wasn't anything particularly special about either of them, except for two things we would be wise to learn from and wise to put in practice in our life: humility and surrender. They were both humble women. They surrendered everything that they had, everything that they did to God, and their simple faith. There wasn't anything there in their lives to mark them out and say, hey, these are two special people, and surely great things are going to come from them. They're just simple, faithful, graceful women. So what is the purpose of this favor that came upon the two of them? Is it for their elevation to make them more than simple, faithful women? Was it for their fame or their prosperity or social status in their community? It wasn't. The purpose was for really for the blessing of the world forevermore, as they delivered the men who would bring our deliverance: John the Baptist, the forerunner, and the Messiah. This favor is to prepare the way for the arrival of redemption. This favor was God's grace poured out on them for the sake of others. If we remember, we talked about this, probably every year we talked about it, but in Mary's case, as a young, unmarried girl, in the society and the times that she lived in, she could have been, and typically would have been, stoned to death. She knew that at the very least this probably meant a life of homelessness, possibly making out her living through begging or prostitution. But when the angel of the Lord came to her, when Gabriel came to her and said, "You are going to give birth," she didn't question it. She didn't argue it. She said, "If this is God's will, I will receive it. If this is God's will, I'm fine." So we look at, in Mary's case, this favor of God being poured out upon her is not something that we would consider to be good. It's not something that would have been considered to be a blessing. So likewise in our own lives, when God's favor comes upon us, it's not necessarily something that we can look at and say, "Wow, I'm fortunate. This is good. I'm so excited about this." But there is a responsibility that comes along with it. So the next question to think about: why us? Why does God pour out His favor on us? We may not think of it often or even at all in terms of our new understanding of God's favor. But we should. You know, when was the last time maybe that you paused to consider God's favor poured out upon you? We need to think about what has God granted you that involves bearing out a difficult mission. What has God granted you that calls you to a difficult mission? What has God granted you? What grace has He poured out on you that is for the sake of others? See, every one of us looks at situations in our life, circumstances in our life, and we'll say, wow, I've really been dealt a bad hand. Or we may say, life isn't fair. And we have this broken area of our life that maybe isn't necessarily something that God granted us, but His grace upon us in that moment can be carried out to others, to carry out a difficult mission for the sake of others. You think about somebody who maybe grew up in an abusive home, and all the anger and hostility, and we see and read and hear people who use that as the excuse for bad behavior into adulthood. But if you come through that, think about the encouragement, the wisdom, the guidance you can give others who are going through the same thing. Maybe you've experienced difficult relationships or a difficult marriage, a broken marriage even. And think about how through that, it wasn't God's desire for that to occur for you. His grace upon you and carrying you through that time, through that experience, can and should be poured out and invested into others who are struggling in their marriage or struggling through divorce or on the backside of a failed marriage. Think about the encouragement, the counsel that you can give them. Think about how you can pour out God's grace that you experienced into others so that difficult mission can happen. Well, that doesn't mean that it's necessarily easy to share the junk in our lives or the areas or points in time in our life that have challenged us the most. In fact, it's typically pretty difficult to do that. But if we are truly serving God, if we're truly living in surrender to God, we are truly loving Him and loving everyone as He commanded over ourselves, why wouldn't we step into that broken situation? Take that coworker, that friend, that neighbor out to lunch or out for a cup of coffee and just share with them how God worked in your life to deliver you through that. Why wouldn't we just share the good that has come through that broken area of your life and the healing process that they may experience the same? Why would we leave them out on their own island, or why would we just simply echo in the advice and the counsel of the world in the midst of their turmoil, their struggle? So, why us? Why have we received such favor and blessing? God has indeed poured out His grace on us in these ways for the sake of His glory and for the sake of others. And the undeniable fact that He has done that demands a response. We cannot get away from responding to this. If we ignore Him and ignore that act, we are passively choosing to deny Him as our response. Or we can actively choose to honor Him in our response by reaching out to others, by sharing that grace He's poured out upon us. There is no way to avoid responding to Him. We must always look for ways to respond to this favor by giving God glory. Giving God glory, not self, and giving ourselves away for the sake of others. So a few ways that we can live this out, in addition to the notes that we're keeping on the back of the bulletin. I would challenge you to seek an intentional moment every day this week to reflect on God's favor in your life. It may not be easy to sit here this morning and think, oh yeah, this is where God's favor has been on me. This is the difficult mission. This is how I need to serve God by serving others through this. But take time intentionally every day this week to think about, where has God's favor been poured out on your life? What area of your life has He called you to a difficult mission? Has He given you allowed unique experiences in your life to form who you are now, where His grace has been poured out on you for the sake of glorifying Him and benefiting others? A second way that we can begin to live this out, think about the people in your life who you know now or have known. Think about the people who were obedient to God and sharing God's favor in their lives, God's grace in their lives with you. Think about the people in your life who have been a source and a channel of God's grace to you. And thank them for that. Thank them for that obedience and that love. And then, now that you've thought through and hopefully identified where God's favor is in your life towards the end of this week, think about intentional ways that you can be a channel of grace to others. See, in the chaos of our world and our lives, we may be able to identify where God has called us to do something unique, or we may be able to look at this and identify His favor and what we are supposed to do with it. And then it just kind of gets put on the back burner and we move on with life. We have to be intentional in how we are going to serve, how we're going to act. So find intentional ways to be a channel of grace to others. Look at that area in your life where God's favor was poured out on you. Look at where you got that extra grace and getting through a difficult situation. And think about ways that you can transfer some of that grace to other people to benefit their life. To be a mechanism, a tool, a servant of God for the sake of others. So as we wrap up, we need to remember that favor is far more than just a few good breaks or good luck. Favor is also much more than a reward for living right, living a clean life. That actually would be karma, and that really doesn't belong in the Christian faith. Favor is, remember, God's grace toward us for His glory and for the sake of others.